watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 133, Using Java with XPages, Part 2. How you been? Okay, before we get started on the show, it's just some news and updates. NotesIn9 recently hit a milestone, 250,000 downloads, which is way cooler than saying 250,000 downloads, even though my 11-year-old son is quick to point out that they are in fact the exact same number. But regardless, I think it's obviously it's great for the show, and I think it's good for XPages. There's a lot of XPages growth out there, I believe, and I want to thank all my contributors for coming on and helping make that possible, and everybody for watching. And if you do ever have any feedback on this show, just drop me a line. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. My contact information is on the end of every show, and I do love hearing from you, so don't be shy. OpenNTF.org, the center of our open source universe. There's tons of applications there that are just crucial to XPages development. There's snippets, there's custom controls, and guess what? They just got a brand new UI website. I think it's based on BootStrap. It looks great. There's been a team involved in that, and they've been working on that for quite a long time. I don't know everyone on the team, so I'm not going to try to name names and forget somebody, but a lot of effort went forth to provide a new, refreshed website for the community, and I'm just excited to see it, and I think it looks great. IBM Connect's right around the corner. I believe there's Nicholas Heideloff had a post of something like 30 plus XPages related sessions there. So that is really going to be the center of the XPages universe. So if you want to get up to speed on XPages, that's probably the place to be. I mean, not only are there sessions there, but you're going to have the developers are going to be there. The people who actually write the product are going to be available to you easily to ask questions in the lab and get your questions answered and problem solved, hopefully, and maybe tell them about a bug that's been bugging you. I know I've got a little list growing, but they're going to be there, so make use of that. If you are at the conference, I am not speaking this year. I chose not to submit because, quite honestly, I wanted the break. But I will be in probably the front seat of most of the XPages sessions, so feel free to come over and say hi to me. I do love hearing from you, and would like to meet you. And who knows, maybe you want to be on the show. So again, don't be shy. Okay, I am beyond excited not only about this show, but the next 4 shows, because Tim Tripcony is on today's show, and he's also on the next 4 shows. I was talking to him on Skype about this series, and before I was even done, I had like 4 shows from him waiting for me. Who's Tim Tripcony? Well, he's an XPages genius. He's been one of the top XPagers since the beginning, and he continues to be. He works for a company called Best Methods that does a lot of hosting, a lot of mobile development, and Tim, I know, has done a lot of mentoring. So if you are having an XPages problem, or you want to get up to speed, or you need help, Tim's, you can't go wrong going to Tim. He's just a top guy. He's one of the nicest guys around, and he's very approachable. So don't be afraid to engage Best Methods to get your problem solved. So today he's going to continue on from last show, which is basically an introduction to Java, or I guess started off as an introduction to Java, and now is just kind of like how a lot of these things work and how you can make use of using Java in your XPages applications, because you don't always want to have tons of server-side JavaScript on your XPage. It is harder to maintain. There's a bunch of reasons not to, but the goal of this series is to just try to make it easy and digestible to you to maybe get started along the Java path. Since Java and XPages are kind of one and the same, it is kind of a good tool to have in your toolbox. So the goal here is to try to take the fear out of everything and help get you up to speed. So with all that being said, let's go to the demo.
Hello, and welcome to the second video in this series where we attempt to sort of demystify the notion of using Java beans as data sources for our XPage applications. So this video is probably going to be the shortest in the series because we're really only going to look at 2 things. The first is, what types of objects does expression language in the context of XPages just understand natively how to deal with? And then the second is the comparatively philosophical notion of how we achieve good lazy. So first off, there are 4 types of objects that EL just knows how to deal with in XPages. And when I say deal with, what I mean is how to obtain property values and how to modify them. So the first type is just JavaScript objects. So here we have an example of an inline object that just has a single property. Expression language can bind to that object, specifically to properties of that object, and it just knows how to read and write those property values. The second is instances of a Java interface known as a map. Now, you've dealt with this if you've ever used any scope variable, and technically behind the scenes if you've ever used any data source. But session scope, for instance, is a Java map. You don't necessarily have to know that if you only ever write SSJS, but as you start to write Java in XPages, it is good to know that the scope variables are maps. So the third type is actually what we're going to look at the most in this video. And that's instances of a different Java interface that's called data object. Now, again, if you've ever used a Domino document data source, you've also used data objects. IBM just doesn't explicitly tell you that that's what you're doing. But if we know what data object is, then we can write our own custom objects that take advantage of some of the features thereof. So the fourth type that EL just natively knows how to deal with is Java Beans. And if you haven't already watched the first video in this series, I highly recommend that you do so to have some context. So each of these 4 types is handled differently. Behind the scenes, it just knows how to do it for us. Our simple expression language value bindings typically look like what you're seeing under the first bullet in this slide. So you identify an object, and then you specify a property name for that object. And at runtime, these expressions get evaluated into an execution strategy that looks at what type of object is being referred to, and then it just knows how to deal with that. If we were to interact with those objects ourselves in SSJS code, or technically even in Java, then we have to manually figure out what type of object are we dealing with. And we have to just know what code to write to handle the object properly. So if we had an expression of contact.firstname, for instance, we would need to know, is this a JavaScript object? And if it is, then the first name property of the object can just be read and written directly. We can just refer to contact.firstname, whether we're retrieving a value or we're providing a new one. If it's a bean, however, then we need to be familiar with bean conventions. So again, going back to the first video, we saw that there's this notion of getters and setters. So if I have a first name property, for it to be a valid bean, I have to have a getFirstName method that presumably returns the value of that property. And I have to have a corresponding setFirstName method that accepts the new value to assign to that property. If it's a map, like the scope variables, then the getters and setters are just called get and put. But they're sort of independent. They're not, the getters and setters in a bean are kind of hard-coded in the sense that they're named based on the property that they're associated with. In a map, they're generic. So if we want to retrieve the value of a first name property and the whole object that is storing these properties is a map, then we just call get, but we pass it first name as a string. If we want to write the value, then we call put, and we pass it the name of the property we want to modify and its new value. So you've probably already done that with scope variables. But if you're dealing with your own map objects, then that would be the same syntax. And finally, if we're dealing with data object, then we have methods called getValue and setValue. And the method signature is very similar to that of a map, in that if we want to read the value, we pass it the name of the property. If we want to write the value, we pass the name of the property and the value to assign to it. If you follow my blog or you've read answers or comments I post on Stack Overflow, you've probably seen me beating this horse. That don't use replace item value, don't use get item value, use get value. Well, ultimately, this is why. There's many reasons you should do this, but long term, the reason you should get in the habit of calling get value and set value is sooner or later, you're going to want to define your own data object instances, your own data object implementations. And when you do, if you're already in the habit of calling get value and set value when you're dealing with your documents, then you're going to be in that habit and just instinctively do that for your custom objects. And just so happens that'll be right. So philosophically, what I think we should be targeting is this notion of good lazy. This is something that you might also have seen on my blog or in Stack Overflow, or if you've seen me speak in person or basically had any programming discussion with me, at some point you've probably heard me or seen me refer to the notion of good lazy. I've left some quotes up here as just representations of why and or how that's a good thing. But in the context of programming, what I define as good lazy is writing less code that produces the exact same or even a better result, but also something that is easier to understand and easier to reproduce. But basically, all this means is that over the long-term spectrum, we always want to be pushing to a point where it's easier to do what we do, and yet we're giving better results to our users, our employers, our customers, and so on. So let's take a look at how we can make a subtle shift from what you saw in the first video to something that furthers that aim. So here's the user interface. And one of the first things you'll notice is that the UI looks a little different. But all that's going on here is I've applied some additional theme stuff. If you want to look at it, the repository is open, it's public. Feel free to clone the repo and take a look at how this is implemented. But the good news is it's almost no code. So, but the main thing I want to call your attention to is that in the previous video, all we had for the contact details was first name and last name. And in this, we've added a few additional properties. So if we go to the X page, we're seeing what you would probably expect. In the previous video, we had an input text that was bound to first name, another one that was bound to last name. And in this, we've simply defined some additional editable components that are bound to additional field names. Now, based on the precedent that was set in the first video, one would expect that our model class, data model, in using MVC terminology of model, is going to have a lot more code, right? Because we need to have explicit getter and setters for each property. Except as it turns out, you don't. In fact, if you compare this to the previous iteration, there's actually far less code. The reason is twofold. One is a lot of that code has simply moved to a class that we're now extending. But the other reason is because that class, which we'll look at in a moment, is making use of this data object notion that I referred to earlier. So if we look at this class, we see that it in turn extends abstract map model. Now, we're going to look at what this is actually doing in a moment, but first I want to walk you through this class, the one that this extends. So I guess you could say this is sort of the new grandparent of contact model. If we consider abstract document map model its parent. Now, this class is just a wrapper for a map, and a fairly generic one at that. Normally with a map, you're going to have something like string as the key and a specific data type as the values. But in this case, we're going as pretty much as generic as you can for a map. And in a few moments, it'll become clear as to why that is. There are two Java interfaces that this class implements. If you don't know what interfaces are in Java, as opposed to just classes, that's something you may want to look into because it's a key concept in Java. XPages make heavy use of interfaces, and we can too, but only if we understand how and why. The first interface that this implements is called serializable. Now, all this does is it tells XPages it's safe to put the state of this object somewhere, besides just storing it in memory. So if XPages decides it wants to write out information about this class to the hard drive in a folder or whatever, we're just telling it we're okay with that. We don't actually really have to do anything in our class to make that possible. Data object, however, is also an interface. Now, in the previous video, Dave mentioned that one of the cool things about Java is because it has a mature, robust editor, one of the many things it does for us is every once in a while, based on something that you've clicked, it will choose to highlight other things that it thinks you might find interesting or pertinent. Now, in this case, it's highlighting 4 of the 5 internal methods of this class. And the reason is because data object is an interface, and one of the things that is typical with interfaces is usually for it to be a valid implementation of an interface, usually your class has to implement certain methods. Serializable is actually kind of unusual in that you don't. There aren't any methods you're forced to implement just to say that something's serializable. Data object, on the other hand, requires that your class have 4 specific methods, otherwise it's not a valid data object. So the first 2 that I want to highlight are the ones that I've already mentioned, getValue and setValue. So as you can see, getValue will be passed a property name. Now I'm just calling that key here because it's less typing, and since internally we're dealing with a map, maps have keys and values, so I went with that naming convention, but basically you can consider this the property name. In the context of a document, that would probably be a field name. So getValue will be passed a property name, setValue will also be passed a property name, but it will also be passed the new value that should be assigned to that property. So in this class, the way that I'm choosing to implement that, because any implementation of data object can make its own completely arbitrary decisions on what is actually meant by getValue and setValue. You can do anything you want here. In this case, all I'm doing is shoving stuff in a map. So the only method this class has that does not directly contribute to its being a data object is a method that automatically instantiates the map for us. So if we ever call getValues and values doesn't actually exist, we make sure that it does. That's it. Now, I've made this method protected as opposed to private because a pet peeve of mine is when people design classes that can't be extended. When you define a class as protected and somebody overrides or extends this class, then they can define their own getValues. And they can also call getValues. If you define it as private, then extensions to this class don't even know this method exists. Big pet peeve of mine, so I always set my methods to protected unless there's a very specific reason why it should be explicitly public or private. Anyway, end of rant. So all that getValue and setValue are doing is it's saying get this internal map, getValues, and either store a value in it or retrieve a value. So that's it. For my implementation of data object here, That's basically it, is I'm just addressing this internal map. But there are a couple other methods that data object forces you to implement that are actually kind of interesting. The first is get type. Basically what this does is, if we have an EL expression that is bound to an instance of this, and it's, say, contact.firstname, well, then the key is going to be first name, and XPages is automatically going to call at any time it needs to. It's automatically going to call for us this get type method to determine, well, what is a first name? So in this case, all I'm doing is I'm looking at the map and I'm saying, well, if we do have a value for that property, then tell me what it is. What's it an instance of? So first name, it's probably going to return the class associated with strings. If it's birthday, probably a date, right? As you start to use these types of techniques for increasingly fancy stuff, then you could do anything you want here to tell XPages what data type to expect based on the property that it's asking for. But in this case, we're going simple. The other method that data object forces us to implement is called isReadOnly. So in this case, I'm just saying, let everything be editable. Because, by default, we want to assume everything's editable. But because this is a public method, we can override this in our descendant classes, and we can say, oh, well, let me look at what's being asked for and determine, based on any number of criteria, whether or not we should allow the user to edit that. And in a moment, we'll use that as one example of where we can make our contact smarter. In the meantime, though, I just want to take a quick look at this sort of middle layer class. So again, this extends our abstract map model, so it knows about all this stuff, but it doesn't know about this. This is our middle layer. And so if you look closely at this class, you'll see that it sort of, most of our code has now moved here. So that every time we define a new type of data model, maybe it's going to be a customer, an employee, or an office location, it doesn't really matter, right? But every time we define one of these, we don't have to build in all this logic. We just tell it, you're one of these, and so you know how to do everything it knows how to do. What's really changed in here is load and save. So it's still got the logic about, well, do I have a unit, am I a new document, etc. But what's going on here is, if I'm loading values, basically if I do have a unit, this isn't a brand new document, I use this notion of wrapping what I call a 1996 document, the original Lotus.domino API, wrapping it in the smarter XPages form of a document. This is the Java class that's actually associated with the Domino document data source. So basically we're saying, well, I want to get an old school document, but I want to have all the convenience methods that that XPages added to the API. And so all we're doing here is we're looping through any items the document already has. So instead of having explicit calls now to, I want to set first name to the first name item, I want to set last name to the last name item, we're just going to loop through all of them. And now I've put in here a non-comprehensive list of items that it should probably ignore. Another good one might be things like $ref. But basically, if it's not, one of these built-in fields, so this will catch all of our custom stuff, right? First name, last name, birth date, all that, email. Then call set value, this base set value method that we defined, with whatever the current value is of that item. So in other words, we're just loading up a map here. We're loading that all into memory. And then save just does the reverse. So we loop through the entry set of the map. So we just get everything that we're storing in memory, and then we shove it back to the document. Now, one thing I do want to highlight here is I have this Domino util class that I added, and I basically ripped off a very weak subset from the OpenNTF API. One of the many, many things that API does is, by default, when you're storing stuff in a Domino document in Java, you have to be really careful about what type of data you're passing it. For instance, you can't just give it a date, a standard Java date. You have to create one of these very specific Java date time or Domino date time objects. You can't just give it a Java date, it'll freak out. Which of course is ridiculous, but that's just one of the many things you just have to know when you're dealing with Domino in Java. So the OpenNTF API is very lenient about that. Basically, you can give it just about anything, and it'll figure out what Domino needs that to be in order to safely store it. For this example, I've just created or pulled in a very small subset of that. So dates and calendars, which are essentially dates. Something that is essentially a string, but Domino's not going to know that it's a string. Numbers and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm using that here so that I can just say, well, let's loop through the map, and anything that's in there, shove it into the document. The only other thing that I really want to highlight about this, well, actually, there's two things, sorry. The first is, in the earlier iteration, we hard-coded the form name. Now, at this layer, I want to be able to extend this for all of my forms, right? All of my model types. So rather than hard-code it at this layer, I'm saying this is going to be an abstract class. I'm never going to instantiate it directly. I'm only going to instantiate extensions, contacts and employees and customers and purchase requisitions and whatever. So this is an abstract class, so I can define abstract methods like get form name. So in the save, this says, well, whatever the form name is, store it when it's a new document. So that forces my contact model to actually implement get form name. But here's where I can hard code that or do some other logic to determine what the form's going to be. But now that's the only thing that has to be specific at this layer. That's the only thing that this model enforces that you have to do differently for each one of these things. The rest of this class can basically be blank because all of the smarts is at this layer. The second thing I wanted to highlight was simply that I built in some logic here that when you call save on the contact now, first it calls query save. And by default, that's just going to return true. But in my contact model, I could then override that and say, well, I'm going to check field values or roles or day of the week or whatever and determine whether I want to return false and block the save. Similarly, if our save is successful, assuming that query save returned true, then it's going to do a call to post save, which again, by default is just going to return true. But similarly, at this layer, I can say, well, I want to define a post save event. And depending on what happens, I might still return false because when you have event handlers in XPages, when you do an action group, any one of those actions can return false to cancel the rest. So I might go ahead and save the document, but then additionally try to do stuff. And if I can't do that successfully, then I want to block any additional actions in the action group. In this example, we're not going to bother with that. But that's the kind of thing we can do now. And so here's where we're starting to see some of the good lazy, right? By having these layers in here, now I only have to write the code that is unique to this. I don't have to have explicit getters and setters for all my fields. I don't have to have hard-coded load and save logic in every one of my models because it's a document. So in memory, I'm going to store everything in a map. And then when it's saved, I'm going to shove everything that's in the map back to the document. There's no reason to have that logic on every single bean that we bind to. Now, I say bean, but ironically, this isn't a bean because it no longer conforms to bean conventions, right? There's no getters and setters. So it's not a bean, it's a data object. So in how XPages is going to treat this, it's going to treat it exactly like it was a document, but then we get to determine what it does when that happens. But we've structured it so that we only have to write the code for the stuff where we actually want to intervene. So let's look at one example of that. I mentioned earlier, let's import that class so we get the red squiggly to go away. Mentioned earlier that one of the things you can do on a data object is intervene for determining whether a specific property is read-only. So in this case, actually, let me remove this first, do a build, let's replicate, go back here. So by default, all the properties here are editable, right? So I can set dates and strings and all that. Everything's just, you know, it's just open. But what if, just for one property, I want to override that behavior? So maybe I don't want somebody's job title to just be arbitrarily changed. Maybe I only want to allow HR to do that. So by default, I'm going to say, well, for everything else, let's just return whatever this extends from. So maybe contact actually extends employee, and employee has its own rules for what's read-only. But on a contact, we're going to define additional rules for read-only. So to do that, we call out to super. Now in this case, super is always going to return false. Nothing's going to be read-only. But if we had 2 or 3 or 8 layers here, then each layer can contribute its own rules for what's read-only. So again, at each layer, we only want to write the code that we have to. That's the good lazy, right? And so in just a few lines of code here, I can say, well, on a contact, if the property that's being asked for is job title, and they don't have the HR role, then we're returning true to the question of is read-only. So if I build that again and replicate again, now we see that job title is in fact read-only because I don't have the HR role. But we're not applying custom rules to any other properties. So when XPages evaluates the expression that says contact.employer, it says, well, is the employer property read-only? Since we're not applying custom rules to that, that question is returned a value of false because it's not read-only, it's editable. So as a result then, when we want to define an XPage that has an arbitrary set of properties, and by the way, this is how standard Domino document data sources allow you to define fields, so to speak, on your XPage that aren't defined anywhere else. They don't have to be on the form. There doesn't have to be a Java class that is explicitly aware of a notion of first name and last name. And the reason is because Domino document is a data object. So it just uses these get value, set value, is read only, and all of that to figure out how to handle that. So we can just arbitrarily define fields on an XPage. And that's something that we kind of lose if we're using standard beans for our data sources. because all of a sudden, to bind to first name and last name, we have to have a get first name, set first name, get last name, set last name, and duplicate that for the other 100, 200, 500 fields that might be on the X page. But by this one subtle shift of saying, well, no, I'm just going to have a map, and I'm going to wrap that in get value and set value. And then the contact model is going to be some extension of that map. Then I can just arbitrarily add anything I want here. And so I could say favorite color. And notice I haven't changed the job at all. But, now this is a lie, but I think that name is funny. So now if I go back to another record, go back to my own, it's saved the value. I didn't write any new Java. I just arbitrarily added a brand new property to my X page. And it just works, right? But as a result then, if I want to write custom code that deals with one of these, now I can. So now we've said that in addition to job title being read-only, favorite color is read-only as well. So hopefully that gives you some indication of how some of these transitional steps can get you to where you can write less code than you were writing, and yet you can do more interesting and potentially powerful things. So again, being good lazy, not just writing less code because, you know, I don't feel like it, but writing less code because, as you'll see in a later video, if we do one specifically on how to do this fancy theme and have it be simple, if I'm writing less Java code to do fancier stuff than I'm even doing in my SSJS code, then I can actually spend more time making my user interface compelling and modern and pleasing to users. So that's really ultimately the true value of finding good lazy in XPages, is that it's not as hard to do the functional stuff. So we can actually invest effort in making our applications modern and pleasant and impressive to users. And so they actually know that Domino is a modern, powerful, impressive platform, instead of just assuming, well, Domino is Lotus Notes, therefore it's 1989 technology.
And that's the demo. I thank Tim for coming on, and I can't wait for the next show. And if you have any questions for me, here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.